Welcome to the Big Scope interviews. And today we're talking to one of the more interesting men in the blockchain field in India. We're talking to Pandurang Kamat, the chief architect of the research and development arm of Persistent Systems. Welcome to the show, Pandurang.
Hey, thanks for having me. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. So, Pandurang, before we get into the ecosystem in India and what Persistent is doing, how did you get interested in blockchain?
Sure. So I had been tracking, Bitcoin off and on as a development, and for a couple of years since it started, starting about 2012 onwards. It's around 2014-15 where a lot of conversation in the technology community changed from just Bitcoin to the underlying tech called blockchain. And that started to emerge as an independent entity that could have applications much broader than Bitcoin. And at the time, as part of Persistent's CTO unit, one of my main charters is to look out for technologies that are going to matter to Persistent and our customers, 2-3 years down the line, and start adopting some of those early. So back in 2015, we made a case to our CEO and sponsors to kind of fund a blockchain R&D unit within Persistent, and begin an early scoping about how this technology is going to evolve and where it's headed and how it can benefit our customers. So, that's how the journey began, and we've been experimenting, we've been working with customers, we have been building pilots and POCs, and engaging our customers in building even full-blown solutions on blockchain since then.
So that brings up a pretty interesting topic. How much pushback do you receive when you go to a company or when you go to your bosses and say, hey, I want to do development in blockchain. I want to build a blockchain-based technology for your company. How much pushback do you get? Do you see a lot of enthusiasm?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So one of the, internally we don't have that pushback because we made, once we made that early case, the way our R&D works is that, at a quarterly level, we have to kind of assess both internally and prove to our sponsors, that internal sponsors, that this is a viable technology, and we have to show proof of that. So internally, the leadership within Persistent is pretty convinced. What you are asking also about is when we go to a customer and talk about blockchain, what's the response? So early on, the response used to be, so what is it, and why would I spend all these CPU power in mining and so forth? And then we try to explain that enterprise blockchain space is different from what people hear about Bitcoin. There's not necessarily all this mining involved. The CPU and computational intensive applications are different. And one of the things we realized early on is you got to not just take a technology-centric approach. You got to take a business value approach. So when we have the conversation is always about where can blockchain help your business, right? How can it deliver value beyond what you're getting today with the technologies of today? And then you kind of work it backwards, that if you want to get that value, here's a great tech that's is still evolving, but it's going to get you that value, and that conversation goes much easier. So we typically position this in 3 axes, either as the first thing is an optimization thing. So typically in the enterprise space, blockchain tends to help optimize several internal or cross-organizational processes, reconciliation of things, supply chain tracking, things of that nature, right? So an optimization piece, whether even in the banking space, settlement and transfer of assets, tracking of assets. So optimization is a great axis to show an ROI on why this will deliver value. It'll either cut time, add to your bottom line, and so forth. The other thing is threat. A lot of our customers potentially could be intermediaries in business process, and blockchain, as you know, is one of the technologies that's been slated to disintermediate, right? Take the intermediaries out if they don't provide anything beyond basic trust and escrow type functionality. So the other axis we view is that threat axis, which is to show our customers that if they don't reinvent some of their business models, there is a potential risk here. And finally, the third thing is opportunity. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So I just wanted to know, you've obviously laid out the basic tenets here, but
Yeah.
A lot of people don't know can be used to build a currency. That's the most famous usage so far. But what kind of
Yeah.
usage models are you looking at? Do you do financial services? Do you do supply chain services? What do you do?
Sure. So we, as a company, we focus on financial services, healthcare, and IoT and industrial things in many cases. But we've worked with customers across other domains as well. So let me give you maybe some examples, right? One of our customers is in the mortgage, loan and mortgage automation space in North America. They're one of the largest players in that space. One of the business opportunities we saw there was they had, when you create a mortgage, a lot of this is now digitized, so it resides in their IT system. But a mortgage doesn't remain with a single company for the 30-year lifespan that it exists. It gets sold in the secondary market, is investors market, right? And these are institutional investors. So one of the typical problems there was once you sell this to a secondary investor and then it goes changes hands a couple of times more, it becomes very hard to track the ownership, the provenance of this given mortgage, also to find and trace all the documentation and move that custody across these multiple hops. And so one of the problems we help them model on blockchain and solve for them is how can you track the provenance and ownership and integrity of all the data associated with a mortgage, even as it changes hands over its lifespan across institutions, right? And the second related problem there was the custody and integrity of that data. So typically they were using a third party as an attester to the integrity of that data. So that problem also gets solved because you no longer need a third party in the picture purely to tell you nothing has been changed here. So you were saying something.
Yeah, so basically what you're saying is you're creating an indisputable land rights document saying, yeah, it was owned by them in 1990, by these people in 1994, these people in 1998. Something that can't be disputed because it's on a technology that everyone knows can't be corrupted. Is that the basic function you're performing for this particular company?
Sure. So it's not necessarily land rights. It's about the ownership of that mortgage lien, if you will. But the same principle can be applied to land rights as well. And as you know, the governments in India, particularly Andhra Pradesh government, has taken a lead in experimenting with trying to digitize and move land records to blockchain. But yeah, that's the exact same thing, but in a different context. In the government context versus in a banking context was the first example. Yes.
So speaking of the Andhra government, I mean, they've obviously taken the issue forward with land rights with land rights blockchain, and they're opening a university to study this technology. But how have you seen governments across the world and in India, have they been aggressive in adopting blockchain or have they been hesitant?
Well, there has been a mix of both. But one thing is clear at the end of 2017 was that there are very few governments, particularly progressive governments, that are staying out of it or taking a sideline approach. There are almost none in the developing as well as developed nations that are completely staying out of it. The rate at which people are moving is different across different, not just different government, but different sections of the government. The financial regulatory authorities, for example, will move much more cautiously than, say, a land record example, right? Because there's a lot at stake, a lot needs to be vetted and so forth. But in India, we are particularly enthused that both at the state level, states like Andhra Pradesh, states like Maharashtra, states like Madhya Pradesh are taking initiative and experimenting or piloting different projects on blockchain. And if you've heard the budget speech as well as the Prime Minister's speech, at the center as well, Niti Aayog is driving a major initiative centrally around multiple axes of experimenting with blockchain, with healthcare, with land records, and I think with educational certificates, if I'm not mistaken, at least 3 of these things they are driving. So we are very optimistic both in India as well as abroad.
All right, so then let me ask you a question, which doesn't get asked too much to people I've seen. Now, okay, assuming all of this goes well, the state governments adopt blockchain, the central government adopts blockchain, and the banks start adopting blockchain. Now, one of the models I've heard talk of is adopting blockchain for the stock market, so the BSE or the NSE. Now, it sounds great. You save a lot of money, you save a lot of time to invest because you don't need to have the go-betweens to make sure everything's all right. But this does, like you were saying earlier, it gets rid of a lot of jobs of people who who are intermediaries, people who are just there to perform an issue of trust, make sure the two guys doing whatever they're doing, they trust each other. But if
Yeah.
blockchain comes into this across the country, across the world, that means a lot of these people are going to be put out of a job. So how do you see that figuring in? Do you see the government having an alternate plan for employment, or do you see them just saying, oh, go out and reskill yourselves?
So that's a fairly complex question to answer. Let me try and attempt it this way, right? I think whenever a new technology has emerged, right, from the days of the first computer through the internet, through automation and AI now, and now blockchain, this question gets asked again. I mean, does technology replace humans, and if so, what happens to jobs, right? But what we have discovered through history is each time technology killed a particular job, new jobs and new opportunities get created, right? And the same thing is going to happen here. There's a ton of jobs that are getting created in terms of building these systems. There is going to be a governance structure required around these systems. So a lot of these people with the financial expertise that are currently in the process of settlement or asset transfer that are going to be disintermediated, a lot of them are still going to be around doing things that are, whether it's oversight, whether it's governance, whether it's compliance checking, and so forth. So there is no definitive answer that blockchain is somehow going to kill a ton of jobs and not create that many, in other opportunities. If you think about just thinking about traders, stock brokers, and stock traders themselves, right? You remember the scenes from movies about people trading and shouting at the market floor and so forth.
Right.
And today, thousands of those jobs no longer exist. But it's not that these people have not found employment elsewhere in the same sector. Something similar is going to happen here is my take on this. But I am not a macroeconomist, so I don't really know how this will play out. Yeah.
All right. So then let's go back to Persistent and what Persistent are doing. So I hear that you've been working on decentralized apps for the government and for some companies. Can you tell us what exactly you've been doing in that space?
Sure. So decentralized apps is actually one of the most exciting applications of blockchain in the long run. Essentially, what are applications really? We have these mobile apps running on our phone. They are talking to a server in the cloud. If I'm using Gmail, it's talking to a Google server in a data center somewhere. But Google has rights on my data. Whatever I store with them, they control it. They could do whatever they want with it, within the terms of service of the agreement. I have very little control on my own data when I use these services. So one of the opportunities that the likes of Ethereum, which is a decentralized computing platform based on blockchain, brought forth is the idea that I could have an app on my phone that talks to a smart contract that is not controlled necessarily by any entity. I could have my own smart contract deployed, and it could use other services that other companies are providing and let me use those services, but while retaining control on my data. So we took that to heart and we built a decentralized digital locker, we called it. It's similar to the concept to the Government of India digital locker or a Dropbox, for example, except that anything I upload in that cloud gets encrypted on my phone, gets routed through my smart contract and stored on a decentralized storage. And in a future where the friction of using such apps is going to go down, we can seamlessly use this to store my files and pay through utility tokens, if you will, like Ether or Filecoin or whatever else that comes up, where I pay per use, and the data, all the encryption keys never leave my phone. And if I need to recover from a lost phone or a crashed phone, I can put an encrypted backup of all this in the cloud and recover it using a passphrase they don't know. So essentially, full autonomous control on my data, potentially my identity, my certificates, everything else, and yet the benefits of cloud, always on availability, and so forth. So that's the vision, and we built a prototype for showing how that would work.
So that's pretty great, because you managed to combine the trustlessness of the blockchain system while also solving the issue of what happens if I lose my password by putting everything on the cloud. That's quite brilliant, actually. So before we let you go, I have a question that may be a bit of a big question, but how do you see the blockchain system, blockchain ecosystem in India? Is there a lot of growth? Is there a lot of reason for positivity, or is there a lot of pushback?
I don't see pushback. I'm very optimistic. It's see, one of the things with blockchain is you don't need anybody's permission, so to speak, to build the public applications. You of course need a market where people are going to buy those services that you're building on top of it. So I see positive steps from the government. I've already talked about that. I see a lot of positivity in the financial sector. I know NSE and possibly BSE looking at how to optimize the process of settlement. Today you have T+2, I think 2 days plus to transfer DMAT shares and so forth. So how can you optimize that? You've heard of BankChain, the consortium that State Bank of India has led, and along with a bunch of other banks. There's a lot of action happening there. I haven't seen equal level of action in healthcare in India, but it's happening elsewhere in the world. There's a lot of startups that are coming up in whether it's supply chain tracking, whether it's provenance tracking of high value goods, and so forth. So a lot of that action going on. But the news cycle seems to be dominated with the talks of crypto tokens and ICO. But I think at the ground level, there's a lot of sound work that is happening, which is very exciting. So I'm seeing 2018 as a year where we do a lot of breakout, if you will, within India. The domestic companies will emerge as well, and fairly optimistic about how this will play out in India as well.
So speaking of this, of all this stuff happening in India, the Indian government has talked a lot about how we need to be the first to 5G, the first to understand the Internet of Things. And a lot of people are talking about how blockchain can be an underlying technology to secure the data that's going to be going through the Internet of Things protocol systems. So do you see any interesting blockchain companies trying to solve that problem in India?
So let me answer this way. I don't think in Indian context I've come across, maybe there are, I haven't particularly studied that, but there are companies globally that are looking at this problem. My view on the convergence of IoT and blockchain is that there are certain niche use cases, but almost 90% of the material I've read online, the opinion pieces that people have written, are fairly vague about it. As somebody who has kind of been in the trenches for the last 2 years, there's a lot of gap between what people pontificate and what's achievable today, what's achievable down the line. I think people attribute a lot of things that blockchain can do in IoT space that is not really possible or useful. I do believe, however, when we talk about IoT devices being able to log transactions into blockchain, there is going to be for that, particularly in applications like supply chain, particularly in applications where you have peer-to-peer transactions. Think about your electric car being charged in my garage while I'm out, because my charger just charges you in some token and you can charge it and move on. You don't need to find the next petrol station, right? So that kind of thing. I do see there's potential, and I think there's going to be a hardware plus software play there because there needs to be certain basic computational capability in that IoT device to be able to do a transaction on its own, to be able to sign it and so forth. Otherwise, you're just pushing the trust up the cloud. And if you see the adversary profile or the threat profile in IoT, the device is the most vulnerable piece there. So you got to use a very common sense approach and a very well-grounded approach, not try to take blockchain there as a solve it all. It's not going to solve everything for you in IoT. Scalability is a big issue. Interoperability is a big issue in IoT space, even without being in blockchain. And there are some of these problems which help you solve by bridging the gap between interoperability and so on. But it's not a solve-all, catch-all in the IoT space. So to sum it up, I think there is applications there in making things more secure, making supply chains more secure, making peer-to-peer transactions possible, and building kind of dynamic networks through. Think about it in this manner. Like if you have a device that doesn't have its own network available, but it can pay for network bandwidth through an intermediate gateway of a third party through a common token and get its data across securely. Right? That kind of dynamism you can bring in. But we are a few years away from materializing that, but that's where I think the research is going.
So speaking of all of this, do you think that if we increase blockchain adoption, in financial services and across the board, do you think it'll promote more of a sharing economy?
I think yes. It's not necessarily the goal of it, but yeah, the sharing economy typically, today, even when you talk about the Airbnbs of the world, there is an Airbnb in the middle taking 20% or whatever cut, right? Because and they are not just a middleman. They provide a lot of value-added services, facilitation, standardization, payments, and all of that. But I think in a sharing economy, blockchain is going to be playing a catalytic role in kind of making it easier, cheaper, and smoother to transact with your peers and buy and sell assets, particularly digital ones, or transact without having an intermediary just for the purpose of providing security. But typically somebody still needs to build an application where you can discover things, where you can share feedback and so forth. That application is going to charge you either as an upfront fee or per use. So that it's not going to be free. Just the payment models are going to change. I think it's becoming more less friction, basically. That.
So now let me just ask you, as someone who's in his 20s, there's a lot of people my age who are getting out of college, who are in their first or second jobs, and they may be trying to figure out, okay, how do I switch to the blockchain field? How do I get involved in blockchain development? Do you have any advice for young coders, young developers who want to get involved?
Absolutely. I think this is one of those technologies that is going to remain with us and shape the way communications and transactions happen over the internet over the next decades, multiple decades. It's as foundational as TCP/IP. So if you're a technical person, or even if you're a lawyer or any other profession which is relevant, people are getting into this space. So I would say start by reading the original blockchain paper from Satoshi to get a foundational understanding of where his or her vision of blockchain emerged from and why it emerged. It's very important to understand fundamental concepts like decentralization, what it really is and why it matters. It is important to understand the cost and overhead of building decentralized applications and therefore being able to weigh the trade-offs. Then I would suggest you move on to, there is a whole set of resources, and maybe you can share a link for your viewers to look at public blockchain platforms are evolving, and then take a look at private blockchain platforms. Like in the public space, Ethereum is a great platform to look at. They're doing a lot of developers are doing a lot of good work continuously in that space. In the private space, Hyperledger, which is led by Linux Foundation and IBM and others, is a great platform to look at. Quorum, or rather the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, which is led by Microsoft and others, is a great platform to look at. I think it's important for people to really get into the technology and understand. And one of the things you have to do there is completely shut out all the noise around trading of crypto tokens and ICOs, because a lot of the ICOs, and there are more than 1,500 or 2,000 of them now globally, most of these are not necessarily going to be around 3 years from now. Right? So think of the early days of the internet. In that sense, building a decentralized internet is like the next phase of the internet, and we are very, very early in the infrastructure phase of this. So fundamental work that's being done by Bitcoin developers, by Ethereum developers, by Hyperledger developers, and others is going to give us a robust infrastructure where we can build enterprise-grade application. So if you're building applications and people are trying to trade them on exchange and to pump and dump today, those are not going to survive until you have a bedrock of infrastructure that's stable. So I would say, cut out all the noise, dive into the tech, understand it, start thinking from decentralization and what it brings to the table, and that's where you begin your journey. And then you'll be enlightened on your own. You don't need someone else to tell you.
Yeah. So basically, it is you have to do the work. You have to go in there, get through the history, go through all the papers, figure out what you want to do, and then figure out how to do it. It's a very individual, ambitious way of living life, and that's what you got to do if you want to get involved with blockchain.
Absolutely.
So I think just have one other question, which we asked to all of the big crypto blockchain people we bring on the show, is when you first got introduced, obviously you mentioned Satoshi, and he created Bitcoin in the aftermath of the whole global financial meltdown as a way of creating an alternate system to the one that failed. So would you consider yourself a traditionalist, a guy who looks at blockchain and says this is how we change the world, or do you just see it as a nice technology?
That's a very interesting question. A bit of both. I'm pragmatic, of course. I am not. I'm lying if I tell you that I would be out there, leading a revolution and in a crypto anarchist type of way. But I think there's a very good quote from a VC and investor called Naval Ravikant that the arc of the internet is bending towards decentralization, right? And if you hear people like him talk about it, or people like Nick Szabo, who's one of the early cryptographers who, even before Bitcoin, start thinking about these type of decentralized projects. A lot of it is about democratizing access to capital, democratizing access to systems, and breaking down barriers. That a lot of the so-called establishment people or elites, if you will, whether it's in banking or whether it's in other resources, even the internet is run quite centrally, right, by a handful of organizations. If you go down to core routers and so forth. So a lot of this came from how not to be beholden to these things and how to free these up, democratize it. And I get vision, but I'm also pragmatic about looking at blockchain, the underlying tech, and figuring out how we can solve business problems today for our customers and 5 years from now for our customers, and to do so in a more in a sustainable manner. The kind of things people are used to: 5-9 reliability, support, all of that stuff. So I hold both these views in my head, and I don't think they're contradictory. I think they can coexist.
So you're like an optimistic realist.
I'm an optimistic realist, and I'm certainly not an anarchist.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show with us.
Sure. That was my pleasure. Thank you for having me. Fantastic chatting with you. Bye.
Thanks, Pandurang. Is it Skype off or what happened? Skype's off?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
No, Skype's not off. Yeah.
Skype's off.
You should always keep something. There are so many bigger questions.
Sorry.